The initial sound emerged as the sharp clang of metal fastenings breaking loose, reverberating through the shadowed freight compartment like an omen. 4 days of confined obscurity had numbed every faculty, yet that resonance jolted the captives alert. The entrance swung wide, admitting a sliver of wan dawn illumination and the crisp fragrance of maritime atmosphere. Footwear scraped, respiration constricted. None could foresee what lay beyond the aperture, only that starvation gnawed with deliberate, relentless persistence. They descended individually, limbs rigid from maintaining balance in the oscillating compartment, vision adapting as the exterior realm materialized into an enclosed platform and uniformed figures observing from behind darkened lenses. Among them stood Jeff Reiter Wilhelm Brandt, 22 years of age, his facial structure angular enough to project darkness, and adjacent to him the elder Oberg-Reiter Matthias Keller, who harbored a persistent respiratory ailment that had intensified nightly, their exhalations condensing in the frigid atmosphere, merging with petroleum vapors from stationary vehicles. The sentries remained silent. They communicated with abbreviated functional inflections, indicating for the formation to assemble and advance. For the detainees, that quietude proved disconcerting. Silence could conceal anything. Speculation had journeyed with them across the vast ocean. Accounts of Americans treating prisoners as lawbreakers, of deprivation masked as regulation, of vanishing individuals. Brandt struggled to swallow, experiencing vertigo from rising too abruptly. But Keller contacted his forearm as though grounding him to solid earth. The procession commenced with the clatter of restraints upon their equipment and the grinding of small stones beneath their insulated footwear. They traversed a succession of United States Navy personnel unloading containers marked with timestamps more recent than anything the German homeland had witnessed in lunar cycles. Someone within the formation whispered that the containers were likely bait arranged to mock them. Another maintained the Americans were nourishing them for forced work. Keller offered no commentary. He merely calculated paces, conserving respiratory capacity as the coughing threatened resurgence. A current of atmosphere transported an aroma that caused the entire column to falter. Protein cooking gradually, substantial enough to provoke their vacant digestive systems. Brandt reacted with incredulity. For 4 days, they had divided fragments of frozen grain products and a measure of dried fruit salvaged from a sentry's possession. This olfactory sensation, heated, flavorful, undeniably authentic, seemed inconceivable. Even Keller straightened his posture, respiratory passages expanding like a person emerging from a fantasy he never permitted himself to embrace initially. Forward, the column decelerated. The installation appeared through the mist. Spiked boundary material, observation platforms with motionless shapes, sequences of tan canvas shelters, and a timber structure painted with the designation mess line in orderly capital characters. The percussion of serving implements against metallic surfaces resonated outward once more pronounced this occasion as though summoning them ahead. A military member stirred a receptacle the dimensions of a washing basin, vapor ascending upward like an assurance. None among them ventured to believe. Brandt experienced his pharynx tightening with something beyond hunger. He recalled evenings on the eastern battleground when individuals appropriated from their own companions merely to persist, when provisions arrived solidly frozen, and commanding officers claimed atmospheric conditions were responsible. Yet here, in the territory they had been informed was decadent and merciless, the atmosphere carried an essence of plenty, sufficiently powerful it moistened his visual organs. Keller inclined nearer, vocal expression a wheeze. "It cannot be intended for us." His skepticism was comprehensible. German detainees had subsisted on grain-based liquid during transportation, and even that had materialized sporadically. The Americans, conversely, appeared unaffected by scarcities. Brandt observed a culinary worker casually disregard a serving implement of prepared food that had scattered, not troubling to recover it into the vessel. The squandering alone felt surreal. They approached the nourishment distribution, the thermal radiation from the receptacle contacting their countenances, warming epidermis that had not experienced genuine warmth in weeks. A corporal dispensed portions into metallic containers with rehearsed velocity, scarcely elevating his gaze. His detachment troubled Brandt more than antagonism would have. Brutality possessed regulations, but detachment signified they were simply another assignment on an extended morning schedule. When Brandt obtained his container, the mass of it astonished him. Genuine tubers, fragments of bovine flesh, sauce viscous enough to adhere to the metallic receptacle, nourishment that seemed impossible to witness. Keller's extremities quivered as he accepted his own allocation. For a duration, neither relocated. The column behind them shuffled restlessly, but temporal progression seemed to decelerate, as though the elementary action of possessing sustenance required reorientation. They stepped laterally to an extended wooden surface. The initial morsel scorched Brandt's oral organ, but he remained unconcerned. The tastes astonished him. Mineral salts, lipids, warmth distributing through his torso like a glowing fragment igniting combustion. Keller consumed more deliberately, relishing each intake as though committing it to recollection. Surrounding them, other detainees sampled the preparation and exchanged observations that oscillated between wonder and mistrust, as if anticipating the retribution to manifest, but none materialized. No deprecations, no admonitions, no abrupt reversal, only the consistent percussion of implements against containers and the remote avian creatures circling overhead. Brandt completed his allocation and experienced a subtle, unfamiliar sensation, security or something resembling it. Keller exhaled unsteadily, positioning his implement down with reverence. For the initial occasion since detention, the individuals surrounding them appeared less like combatants and more like human beings grasping a moment they could not yet comprehend. As the final vapor drifted from the receptacle and the morning intensified into a more defined, colder illumination, a commanding officer stepped onto a modest platform adjacent to the nourishment structure. His manifestation silenced the enclosure instantaneously. He grasped a writing board, but it was the countenance on his features, calibrated, inscrutable, that caused Brandt to straighten. The commanding officer proclaimed that all detainees would undergo documentation and medical evaluation before transportation to interior installations, but his vocal delivery possessed an inflection that suggested more than procedure. Brandt perceived Keller rigidify beside him. Something in the commanding officer's bearing implied intelligence that could transform their uncertain destiny entirely. For a respiratory cycle, the entire enclosure seemed to suspend its exhalation, the aroma of preparation replaced by the metallic sensation of anticipation. Then the commanding officer indicated toward the distant entrance, where an assembly of military police was approaching with an urgency that caused Brandt's cardiac rhythm to accelerate. Something was about to transform everything presently. The commanding officer's declaration dissolved into a subdued utterance that propagated through the enclosure, but the detainees' attention drifted steadily toward the nourishment structure where the culinary workers continued dispensing steaming allocations. Hunger influenced every cognition. Yet something more profound stirred beneath it, a bewilderment shaped by the recognition that the Americans were not performing like the antagonists they had been cautioned about. Wilhelm Brandt attempted to maintain his respiratory pattern steady as he accompanied Keller toward a succession of seating surfaces. The mass of the meal in his digestive system caused him to feel unbalanced, as though the reality had inclined in a trajectory he could not yet interpret. The documentation station awaited beyond the surfaces. A succession of containers transformed into work surfaces where American administrative personnel recorded designations with mechanical exactitude. A medical practitioner wearing a diagnostic instrument indicated for the subsequent assembly. Brandt and Keller relocated forward with the others, traversing a sentry who stood tapping a writing implement against his documentation board in a deliberate, distracted percussion that somehow caused Brandt more apprehension than outright antagonism would have. The sentry's countenance was inscrutable, but not malevolent. His visual organs scanned over the detainees as though inventorying their depletion. Within the provisional medical enclosure, the warmth persisted from a heating apparatus in the corner. The medical professional motioned for Brandt to position himself on a seat. He complied, grasping its periphery as the medical professional pressed digits into his thoracic cage, examined his cardiac rhythm, and attended to his cardiac sounds. "Undernourished," the medical practitioner murmured, not harshly. "You'll recuperate." Brandt nearly expressed amusement at the assurance in that vocal expression. Recuperation seemed like a conception that belonged to another existence, yet the individual spoke as though it were unavoidable. Keller followed, his respiratory ailment constricting his entire frame. When the medical professional inquired how extended it had persisted, Keller responded with a fatigued inclination of his shoulders. "Months," the medical practitioner acknowledged gravely, then enveloped a heated covering around his shoulders. The elementary motion impacted Keller with unexpected intensity. His mandible tightened, his observation descending to the fabric flooring. For a duration, Brandt observed in him the recollection of a paternal figure who had once enveloped a coat around a shivering child during a Berlin winter, extended before the conflict carved that tenderness away. Following the evaluations, the detainees were directed to another surface where an American corporal demonstrated how to secure the new identification markers issued to each individual. His inflection remained consistent, almost patient, as he guided them through the unfamiliar procedure. Keller struggled with the fastening mechanism, and Brandt observed the corporal step nearer, accepting the chain gently and securing it without a trace of irritation. The action seemed to erode something fragile inside Keller. He blinked rapidly, swallowing forcefully as the individual relocated onward. The detainees were then conducted toward an enclosed courtyard that overlooked the coastal boundary. The ocean extended outward in a vast, frigid azure behind the installation, waves impacting against the distant dock with a percussion that sounded almost like respiration. Individuals stood in modest assemblies, some still grasping their vacant containers, unable to fully process what they had just consumed. A few attempted to articulate of the meal, struggling over the recollection of its sensation, as if fearful it would disappear if they lingered on it too extensively. Brandt positioned himself on a seating surface and permitted the atmosphere to cool his facial regions. The preparation's richness still persisted on his oral organ, but presently it merged with a rising uncertainty. He had anticipated experiencing relief, but instead a peculiar tension wound through him. The propaganda that had saturated his training, posters, radio transmissions, orations about American brutality, now clashed violently with the evidence before him. The contradiction left him adrift, uncertain which component of his reality had been the fabrication. A disturbance arose near the western entrance. An assembly of military police escorted several newly arrived detainees, individuals who appeared even more depleted than the remainder. Their uniforms suspended from their physiques like drying fabric, and one staggered with each pace until a Navy sentry caught his extremity to stabilize him, another motion no one anticipated. Brandt observed the scene with constricted visual organs. That same sentry, broad-shouldered and silent, guided the weakest individual toward the formation for the nourishment structure, elevating the container when the detainee's extremities trembled excessively to maintain it. Keller lowered himself beside Brandt, securing the covering tighter around his thoracic region. "Everything is inverted," he articulated softly. "If this is how they treat us, why would they—" He ceased, unable to complete the cognition. Brant comprehended. Why would the adversary nourish them like this? Why offer warmth instead of punishment? Why squander benevolence on individuals who only weeks previously had been instructed to combat determination rather than fall into American possession? Across the enclosure, a sergeant stood consuming tobacco, his observation sweeping the scene with a mixture of regulation and something almost like compassion. When he detected Brant observing, he acknowledged once. Not a greeting or motion of companionship, merely recognition, but it was sufficient to unsettle Brant again. He turned away rapidly, grasping the seating surface so forcefully his knuckle joints whitened. Component of him desired to believe the Americans were simply presenting a performance, a temporary facade that would soon fracture to reveal truth consistent with the cautions they had matured with. But no disguise could maintain such effortless generosity. Not when no commanding officer was observing the culinary workers or measuring the dimension of the allocations. The afternoon illumination transformed, projecting extended bars of darkness through the wire boundary. The detainees were informed they would be transported interior within days, perhaps hours, depending on available rail compartments. The uncertainty pressed on everyone, yet beneath it was a muted thread of optimism they ventured not vocalize. Transformation was approaching. Of that they were certain, but the trajectory of it remained buried behind the Americans' impassive countenances. Brant perceived the initial vibration before he registered the resonance. Engines. Substantial ones. He stood instinctively, scanning the thoroughfare beyond the installation perimeter. Vehicles approached in a deliberate, measured convoy, their canvas covers oscillating in the atmosphere. Keller arose beside him, his respiration shallow as he scrutinized at the markings on the transports. They weren't provision vehicles. They weren't medical transportation. These bore a different insignia entirely. One neither of them recognized. The convoy advanced to a cessation by the distant entrance, engines idling, particulate matter drifting around the wheels like pale vapor. The sergeant who had acknowledged it Brant earlier stepped forward to greet the arriving commanding officer. Their conversation was too distant to register, but whatever was articulated caused the sergeant to rigidify, his mandible tightening as he observed toward the detainees. Brant experienced the dermal tissue on his extremities rise. The preparation, the coverings, the unexpected humanity, all of it suspended suddenly in the atmosphere like a fragile assurance at risk of fragmenting. The commanding officer who had arrived turned his observation toward the courtyard, scanning the individuals with a cool intensity that caused Brant's digestive system to constrict again. For the initial occasion since the meal, he experienced a flicker of the apprehension he thought he had abandoned in the transport compartment. Something about that convoy was incorrect, and every instinct informed him the genuine test of their detention was only commencing presently. The day following their arrival unfolded with a quiet peculiarity that unsettled Wilhelm Brant more than hunger ever had. The recollection of the initial meal persisted like a fantasy too vivid to trust, its warmth fighting the frigid grasp of years spent absorbing cautions about American brutality. Yet, as morning illumination distributed across the installation, nothing aligned with what he had been instructed. Instead of vocalizations or impacts, the sentries gave calm instructions, relocating the detainees toward stations with an efficiency that left no space for bewilderment. Brant accompanied the stream of individuals with a cautious tension, uncertain which moment would reveal the brutality he still partially anticipated. The medical evaluations resumed following sunrise, extended and more deliberate. Brant entered the enclosure behind Keller, experiencing curiosity pressing down on him. A medical assistant with wire-framed visual correction devices motioned him forward, examining his cardiac rhythm, his thermal condition, his articulations. The medical professional spoke to an administrative person while inspecting a contusion, describing it with an inflection that suggested procedure rather than accusation. Brandt studied the individual's steady extremities and found the sight peculiarly disarming. Keller's evaluation required extended duration. His respiratory ailment worsened overnight, vibrating through the enclosure. When the medical assistant pressed a diagnostic instrument to his dorsal region, Keller flinched and apologized automatically. The medical professional paused, attentive. "You're depleted," he articulated. "Nourishment and recuperation will assist." Keller acknowledged, though disbelief flickered across his features. He had not registered reassurance from any authority in years. Outside, detainees assembled near the boundary, sharing fragments of their evaluations. One whispered that he had been provided ointment for cold-induced injury. Another revealed a medical attendant had enveloped a fresh bandaging around his ankle without chastising him. These were minimal moments, insignificant in tranquility, but in detention they possessed the intensity of revelations. The more they articulated, the more Brandt sensed the foundation shifting under their assumptions. When midday nourishment arrived, thin vegetable liquid with portions of heated grain product, the detainees faltered again, astonished that sustenance materialized twice in one day. Brandt accepted his container deliberately, studying the culinary worker dispensing allocations as if anticipating a reason to retrieve it back, but the individual relocated onward without commentary. Brandt sampled the liquid and experienced a subtle easing in his thoracic region. Keller consumed beside him, pausing every few intakes to stabilize his respiration, the warmth softening the wheeze in his pharynx. In the afternoon, Americans distributed envelopes and paper. The proclamation propagated through the enclosure, stirring unease. Correspondence was an invitation to truth they weren't certain they desired. Brandt accepted his page with trembling digits. He didn't know the destiny of his family and didn't know what this location truly was. He stared at the blank paper until the characters blurred. Eventually, he folded it unwritten, the emptiness reflecting his uncertainty. They were conducted next to the residential structures, new constructions emanating the aroma of cut timber. Within, sequences of sleeping platforms extended consistently along the walls, each with a covering folded at the extremity. The Americans explained regulations and procedures with calm assurance. Brandt walked deliberately between the platforms, moving his digits over the coarse coverings, grounding himself in their reality. Keller eased onto a platform with an exhalation pulled from somewhere profound. As evening approached, a sense of fragile possibility settled over the installation. Detainees spoke in subdued vocal expressions, circling the same inquiries. Could this treatment persist? Was it a facade? What objective did it serve? Some argued the Americans were softening them for forced work. Others maintained no military force squandered resources merely to deceive. Brandt attended, torn between skepticism and the evidence of the day. He stepped outside as the solar body descended, projecting amber illumination across the enclosure. A current transported the essence of maritime minerals and machinery. A solitary sentry stood nearby, inclining casually on his firearm, more observant of the coastal boundary than the detainees. The location reassured Brandt. Menace did not suspend in the atmosphere. Procedure did. The convoy from the previous day remained stationed near the entrance, silent but manifest. Brandt observed it with subtle unease. Its stillness seemed deliberate. Keller joined him, enveloping his covering around his shoulders. "What if everything we were informed was incorrect?" he inquired quietly. Brandt faltered. Optimism crept into his cognition like an intruder, gentle but persistent. The meal, the medical attention, the residential structures, They indicated toward a truth very different from the one he matured believing. Before he could articulate, relocation flickered near the transports. A commanding officer descended from the lead vehicle, documentation in extremity, walking briskly toward the command structure. The sentry straightened. Brandt's cardiac rhythm accelerated. Something in the commanding officer's bearing possessed a gravity that propagated through the atmosphere. Keller accompanied the individual's progression with tense visual organs. Darkness extended across the enclosure as the commanding officer disappeared within the structure. Brandt experienced calm constricting again, curling into a concentration beneath his thoracic cage. The day had shown them a new countenance of detention, one marked by regulation and unexpected grace. But presently, with darkness descending and that commanding officer's arrival, Brandt sensed the fragile truth he had begun to accept was about to be tested. Whether it would maintain or fragment was an inquiry he feared the obscurity would soon respond. Brandt persisted outside the residential structure entrance, experiencing the nocturnal atmosphere cool against his epidermis. He attempted to piece together what had transported him from the freight compartment to this landscape of measured benevolence. Every detail seemed unreal. The manner medical assistants spoke without disdain. The manner culinary workers served nourishment without visual aggression. The manner sentries enforced regulation without brutality. It carved a hollowness in his thoracic region as though component of him were slipping loose. Keller ceased beside him, staring through the boundary at the obscuring coastal boundary. "It shouldn't experience this favorable just to be treated like a person," he murmured. His vocal expression held a fragility Brandt rarely registered. Conflict had hardened Keller early. Stripping sentiment from him extended before they reached foreign territory. Registering vulnerability presently unsettled Brandt more than any menace. A distant acoustic signal resonated from the docks, subdued and resonant, advancing over the installation like a reminder that the reality beyond still transformed, whether they witnessed it or not. Brandt observed toward the resonance, wondering what arrival it signaled. Each transformation seemed uncertain. The following week unfolded with a percussion so steady it seemed almost unreal. Each morning commenced with the clang of the nourishment bell, followed by the orderly shuffling of detainees assembling for initial meal. The meals were plain but generous: grain porridge, grain product, sometimes preserved fruit that caused individuals to stare at their containers as if uncertain they were permitted such sweetness. For Wilhelm Brandt, the elementary consistency of sustenance carved a quiet space within him, a space where apprehension loosened its grasp just sufficiently for clarity to penetrate. Keller improved deliberately. His respiratory ailment softened with each passing day, strengthened by regular meals and the warmth of the residential structures. The coverings, the steady thermal radiation of the heating apparatus, and the patient attentiveness of the installation medical practitioner, all conspired to restore components of him that the conflict had nearly erased. Brandt often detected him studying the sentries, noting their bearing, their unhurried relocations, the absence of malice. The observations seemed to perplex him more than comfort him, as though benevolence further undermined the certainty he had grasped to. Labor assignments commenced soon following their arrival. Brandt and Keller were positioned on a detail repairing containers and organizing provisions under the supervision of a corporal who favored silence over instruction. The work was elementary and repetitive, but Brandt welcomed it. Each container he elevated seemed like evidence that he was being treated not as an adversary to be fractured, but as an individual with extremities meant to accomplish something other than grasp a firearm. He found uneasy comfort in the percussion: elevate, inspect, arrange, while Keller worked with steady determination, grateful for assignments that kept his respiratory organs heated and occupied. The Americans maintained regulations with exactitude, yet there was no brutality in regulation. One morning, when a detainee collapsed from depletion, the sergeant on assignment did not vocalize commands, but summoned for the medical assistant and demanded the individual be positioned on minimal assignment. This minimal action propagated through the compound, challenging the detainee's assumptions more sharply than any oration could. If the Americans wished to weaken them, why protect their strength? Brant pondered that inquiry late one afternoon as he positioned near the boundary, observing the coastal boundary shimmer under a pale solar body. The ocean current transported a persisting essence of petroleum and maritime minerals merging with the terrestrial aroma drifting from the evening preparation. He thought of the propaganda posters adhered across Berlin, Americans illustrated as creatures with appendages dripping with the vital fluid of innocent Germans. He recalled the orations that had maintained surrender signified torture, deprivation, humiliation. Yet, here he was, with a filled digestive system, and a sentry offering him a receptacle of liquid simply because he appeared thirsty. Keller joined him, lowering himself onto the vegetation with a fatigued exhalation. "It doesn't create sense," he murmured, observing an assembly of detainees conversing quietly near the residential structures. "If we're the adversary, why assist us?" The inquiry suspended between them, substantial and unresolved. Brant considered it carefully. Perhaps, he thought, brutality had never been their intention. Perhaps the conflict had forced them into violence, just as it had forced Germany. But that cognition opened another entrance he wasn't certain he desired to traverse through. The possibility that his own beliefs had been shaped by fabrications. The convoy remained stationed near the entrance, silent yet looming. Individuals whispered theories about its objective. Some articulated it transported commanding officers responsible for evaluating detainees. Others believed it signaled a transfer to a different installation. Brant kept his distance, studying it when he could, sensing that whatever awaited them within those canvas-covered transports would determine whether this peculiar balance between apprehension and compassion maintained or crumbled. On the seventh evening, a rare tranquility settled over the enclosure. The solar body descended subdued, washing the installation in amber illumination. Brant and Keller completed evening nourishment and persisted near the nourishment structure, savoring the thermal radiation still radiating from the heating apparatus. Surrounding them, detainees spoke in muted inflections, recounting correspondence obtained from homeland or speculation overheard from sentries. One individual had learned his settlement was gone. Another discovered his sister had persisted. Intelligence transported pain and relief in equal measure, threatening the installation with fragile humanity. Brant opened his own correspondence, extremities unsteady. His maternal parent's handwriting flowed across the page, trembling but determined. She inscribed of scarcities, of bombardments, of optimism that he was vital. She did not mention apprehension, but it penetrated through the spaces between her characters. When he completed reading, he folded the correspondence carefully, pressing it to his thoracic region. Something within him fractured, quiet, and profound. Keller positioned an extremity on his shoulder. "She's vital," he articulated softly. "That's sufficient for presently." It was. And yet Brant experienced the mass of everything unspoken. How she would react if she knew he consumed better as a detainee than she did at homeland. That nocturnal period settled gently over the installation. The sentries switched shifts with brisk efficiency, their illumination devices projecting extended, transforming darkness. Brant observed them from his platform, attending to the rhythmic echo of footsteps on the gravel. He experienced rest influence at him, but resisted. Something was stirring outside, subtle but distinct. A vehicle engine vibrated to vitality. The resonance advanced through the residential structures like distant atmospheric electrical discharge. Brandt positioned upright, cardiac organ racing. Keller stirred, massaging his visual organs as he observed toward the aperture. The convoy had been dormant for 7 days. Its sudden awakening seemed like a signal. Footwear sounds followed, rapid, purposeful. Entrances opened, vocal expressions sharp with command transported through the compound. Detainees arose from their platforms, exchanging uneasy observations. Brandt relocated toward the entrance, drawn by an intensity he couldn't designate. Through the gap between the residential structures, he observed the commanding officer from their initial day articulating with the sergeant. Their countenances were serious, illuminated by the luminescence of an illumination device. The commanding officer held a documentation board, transforming pages rapidly, as though confirming something extended delayed. The convoy's dorsal entrance descended with a metallic percussion, and several military police stepped back, forming a narrow pathway toward the transport. Brandt experienced the dermal tissue arise on his extremities. The commanding officer observed upward, visual organs scanning the sequences of detainees peering from entrances and apertures. His observation settled on the residential structure where Brandt stood. He elevated the documentation board slightly, as though preparing to vocalize designations. Brandt sensed with frigid clarity that whatever materialized next would decide whether the fragile humanity they had sampled here would endure or vanish like the final warmth of solar illumination.